The radar screen flickered once, then went dark. In the suffocating silence of the underground bunker, Colonel Martinez stared at the empty display where Flight Lieutenant Kira Phoenix Voss had vanished just moments before. Her F-16 Fighting Falcon had been tracking perfectly on approach to the heavily fortified enemy installation when the signal simply disappeared. No mayday call, no emergency beacon. Nothing but the haunting static that filled the communication channels like digital ghosts. "Sir, we've lost contact with Phoenix." The voice belonged to Technical Sergeant Williams, his usually steady hands trembling as they adjusted the radio frequency. Last known position was Grid Charlie 7, approximately 12 clicks northeast of the target zone. Martinez felt the familiar weight of command pressing down on his shoulders. 3 hours earlier, he had personally denied Voss clearance for this mission. The brass had been clear. Operation Nightfall was too sensitive, too dangerous for someone with her complications. But Kira Voss had never been one to follow orders when lives hung in the balance. And now she was out there alone, behind enemy lines that hadn't seen friendly aircraft in over 6 months. The bunker's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the faces of the tactical team gathered around the situation table. Maps covered every surface, marked with red zones that represented confirmed enemy positions. Intelligence reports spoke of advanced surface-to-air missile systems, radar-guided anti-aircraft batteries, and a network of underground tunnels that could hide entire armored divisions. It was a death trap, and everyone in that room knew it. "How long has she been dark?" Martinez asked, though he already knew the answer. The mission clock on the wall showed 3:47 hours. Phoenix had been radio silent for exactly 19 minutes and 37 seconds. In combat terms, that was an eternity. Williams checked his instruments again, hope flickering in his eyes. 19 minutes, sir. But her transponder went down at the same time as communications. Could be equipment failure, electromagnetic interference from the mountain terrain. Or she's been shot down. The words came from Major Thompson, the mission's intelligence officer. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too many pilots never come home. "Sir, with respect, we all know what that area looks like. The satellite imagery shows more missile sites than a 4th of July celebration. If she's flying low enough to avoid radar, she's flying low enough to kiss the treetops." Martinez nodded slowly, his mind racing through possibilities. Kira Voss wasn't just any pilot. She was Phoenix, a call sign earned through fire and blood during the siege of Kandahar, where she had pulled off the impossible more times than military doctrine suggested was statistically probable. But even Phoenixes could burn. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, broken only by the distant hum of generators and the soft clicking of keyboards as intelligence analysts worked frantically to piece together any scrap of information that might explain where Phoenix had gone. Outside, the pre-dawn darkness pressed against the bunker's reinforced windows, and somewhere in that hostile sky, one of their own was fighting for her life. 24 hours earlier, the mood in the briefing room had been entirely different. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as pilots filed in for what everyone assumed would be another routine mission briefing. The leather chairs around the oval table creaked as officers settled in, their flight suits bearing the patches and insignia of various squadrons. The air conditioning worked overtime against the desert heat, creating a white noise that masked the nervous energy crackling through the room. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes stood at the front, his weathered face illuminated by the glow of the projection screen. Behind him, satellite imagery showed a complex of buildings nestled in a valley between two mountain ranges. The structures looked innocuous enough from 30,000 feet, just another cluster of concrete and steel in a landscape already scarred by decades of conflict. "Gentlemen," Hayes began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had flown combat missions when most of the pilots in the room were still in elementary school. "What you're about to see is classified at the highest levels. Operation Nightfall represents one of the most critical missions we've undertaken in this theater." The satellite image zoomed in, revealing details that made several pilots shift uncomfortably in their seats. The complex wasn't just buildings, it was a fortress. Concrete walls 20 feet high surrounded the perimeter, topped with razor wire and what looked like automated sentry guns. Guard towers stood at regular intervals, their searchlights sweeping predetermined patterns across the rocky ground. Intelligence indicates this facility is being used to coordinate attacks against our forward operating bases. Hayes continued, clicking to the next slide. Over the past 6 months, we've lost 17 service members to IED attacks that originated from intelligence gathered at this location. The decision has been made to neutralize the threat. Captain Rodriguez, a veteran pilot with over 300 combat hours, raised his hand. "Sir, what about collateral damage? Those mountains look like they could hide a small city." "Negative civilian presence confirmed," Hayes replied. "This is a military target, pure and simple, but that doesn't make it easy. The facility is protected by overlapping fields of fire from SA-15 and SA-20 surface-to-air missile systems. Our electronic warfare aircraft have identified at least 12 radar installations, and we have to assume there are more we haven't detected." At the back of the room, Flight Lieutenant Kira Voss leaned forward in her chair. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, but several strands had worked loose during the morning's pre-flight checks. She studied the satellite imagery with the intensity of someone solving a puzzle, her green eyes tracking the defensive positions with practiced ease. "Phoenix, you've been quiet," Hayes said, noticing her concentration. "Thoughts?" Kira stood, her movements fluid despite the bulk of her survival vest. "Sir, the approach vectors look problematic. If we come in from the east, we're flying directly into the sun at 600 hours. Western approach puts us against the mountain terrain with no escape routes if things go sideways. The northern valley might offer better concealment, but Hayes prompted. "But it's exactly what they'd expect us to do. Every defensive position is oriented toward that approach. It's a killing field." She paused, studying the image more carefully. "What about the southern ridge? The terrain is rough, but if we could get a single aircraft through at low altitude." Major Thompson, the intelligence officer, shook her head. "Too dangerous. The southern approach requires flying through a canyon barely wide enough for an F-16's wingspan. One miscalculation and you're painting the rocks with jet fuel." Kira's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "With respect, ma'am, I've flown tighter formations through worse terrain. The canyon run is doable if you know what you're doing." The room fell silent. Everyone knew Kira's reputation. She was arguably the most skilled pilot in the squadron, with an almost supernatural ability to thread her aircraft through impossible spaces. But they also knew her history, the incident that had nearly ended her career and left her fighting for every mission assignment. Hayes cleared his throat. "Phoenix, I appreciate your input, but this mission requires a different approach. We'll be going in with a 4-ship formation, multiple vectors, overwhelming force. Clean and simple." "Sir," Kira said, her voice carefully controlled, "overwhelming force works great when you're not flying into the most heavily defended airspace in the theater. They'll see us coming from 50 miles out. By the time we reach the target, they'll have thrown everything they've got at us." "That's enough, Lieutenant." Hayes's voice carried a note of finality. "The mission profile has been approved at the highest levels. Your concerns are noted, but the decision is final." Kira remained standing for a moment longer, her eyes still fixed on the satellite image. Then she nodded once, sharply, and returned to her seat. But those who knew her well could see the wheels turning behind her eyes, the way she memorized every detail of the terrain, every defensive position, every possible approach route. The briefing continued for another hour, covering everything from weather conditions to emergency procedures. But Kira's attention never wavered from the screen, her mind already flying through that southern canyon, calculating wind speeds and turning radii, visualizing the mission that everyone else said was impossible. After the formal briefing ended, pilots began filing out of the room in small groups, their conversations a mixture of professional assessment and nervous humor. The mission was scheduled for 600 hours the following morning, giving them barely 12 hours to prepare their aircraft and their minds for what many privately considered a suicide run. Kira was the last to leave, still staring at the now-blank projection screen. Major Thompson approached her, her expression a mixture of concern and professional curiosity. "Phoenix, you really think you could make that southern approach work?" Kira turned, her green eyes meeting Thompson's steadily. "Ma'am, I think 4 aircraft flying predictable attack patterns into a prepared defense is going to get people killed. The southern approach is dangerous, but it's survivable. More importantly, it's unexpected. And you'd be willing to fly it." In a heartbeat, the answer came without hesitation. Those 17 service members who died deserve better than a textbook attack that ends with half our squadron scattered across the mountains. Thompson nodded slowly. "I'll make note of your assessment in my report, but Phoenix, be careful. Your reputation for independent thinking is already causing some people to question your judgment." Kira's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "My judgment has kept me alive through 97 combat missions, ma'am. I'll stack that record against anyone's." As Thompson left the briefing room, Kira remained behind, her mind already working through the tactical problems that would define the next 24 hours. Outside, the sun was setting over the desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded her of tracer fire. Somewhere in those mountains, an enemy waited with patience and preparation on their side, and tomorrow her squadron would fly directly into their trap. The flight line at 500 hours was a symphony of controlled chaos. Ground crews moved with practiced efficiency around the waiting aircraft, their movements illuminated by the harsh glow of sodium vapor lights. The F-16 Fighting Falcons sat in neat rows, their sleek profiles making them look like predatory birds waiting to take flight. The smell of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid mixed with the cool desert air, creating an atmosphere that was both familiar and charged with anticipation. Kira walked her pre-flight inspection with methodical precision, her hands moving over control surfaces and weapon systems with the familiarity of a pianist playing scales. Her aircraft, tail number 880147, bore the subtle scars of nearly 200 combat missions, patches where shrapnel had been repaired, slight discoloration from engine heat, the worn grip of a control stick that had seen more action than most pilots would experience in their entire careers. "Phoenix, you're looking unusually contemplative this morning." The voice belonged to Captain Marcus "Hammer" Davidson, her wingman for the morning's mission. Davidson was a solid pilot, competent and reliable, but he lacked the intuitive understanding of aerial combat that separated the good from the exceptional. He was also one of the few pilots in the squadron who still treated Kira with the casual respect that had once been universal. "Just thinking about the mission profile," Kira replied, checking the alignment of her targeting pod. "How do you feel about flying into the most heavily defended airspace in the theater with a plan that assumes the enemy will cooperate?" Davidson chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "When you put it that way, it sounds like a great way to become a statistic, but orders are orders, right?" "Right." Kira's voice was neutral, but her eyes were already tracking the southern horizon where the mountains rose like a wall against the star-filled sky. Somewhere beyond those peaks, the target waited in its valley fortress, surrounded by enough firepower to turn the morning sky into a killing field. The mission briefing had been efficient and thorough, covering every aspect of the four-ship attack formation. Lead and wingman would approach from the northwest, drawing the attention of the defensive systems while the second element struck from the northeast. It was a classic pincer movement, designed to split the enemy's attention and create multiple threats they couldn't engage simultaneously. On paper, it was flawless. In reality, Kira knew it would result in at least 2 aircraft losses and possibly a complete mission failure. The enemy wasn't stupid. They had prepared for exactly this type of attack, positioning their defenses to create overlapping fields of fire that would turn the approaches into a gauntlet of missiles and cannon fire. "Phoenix, you still with us?" Davidson's voice cut through her thoughts. "Always, Hammer. Just running through the combat check one more time." "Good, because I've got a feeling we're going to need every advantage we can get." As if summoned by his words, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes appeared at the head of the flight line, his command presence immediately noticeable even in the dim light. Behind him walked the other 2 pilots assigned to the mission, Captain Rodriguez and First Lieutenant Chen, both experienced combat pilots with solid records and steady nerves. "Gentlemen," Hayes called out, his voice carrying over the ambient noise of the flight line, "time to earn our pay." The 4 pilots gathered around Hayes, their faces serious in the pre-dawn darkness. The mission brief had covered all the essential details, but Hayes believed in reinforcing the key points before every combat sortie. "Weather is clear, winds from the southwest at 12 knots. Intelligence reports no change in the defensive posture around the target. We'll approach as briefed, strike hard, and get out clean. Questions?" "Sir," Rodriguez spoke up, "what's our contingency if the southern approach shows activity? Intelligence suggested it might be a secondary route." "Negative," Hayes replied firmly. "The southern approach is too dangerous for this mission profile. We stick to the plan." Kira felt the words like a physical blow, but her expression remained neutral. She had spent half the night studying topographical maps and calculating approach angles, working through the mathematics of a solo run through the southern canyon. The numbers were tight, but they worked. More importantly, they offered the element of surprise that could make the difference between success and catastrophe. "Phoenix, you've been quiet," Hayes noted. "Any concerns?" "No, sir," Kira replied, her voice steady. "Just focused on the mission." Hayes nodded approvingly. "Good, that's what I like to hear. Remember, we're not just flying for ourselves up there. Those 17 service members who died deserve justice, and we're going to deliver it." The group broke up, pilots heading to their respective aircraft for final preparations. Kira walked toward her F-16, her mind already calculating fuel loads and weapon configurations. The official mission called for a full air-to-ground loadout, 2 AGM-65 Maverick missiles, 4 Mark 82 bombs, and the standard complement of AIM-9 Sidewinders for self-defense. But as she approached her aircraft, Kira made a decision that would change everything. Instead of the prescribed loadout, she quietly signaled her crew chief to modify the weapon configuration. Lighter ordnance load, maximum fuel, and a single targeting pod that would allow for precision strikes with minimal collateral damage. "Ma'am," Sergeant First Class Williams, her crew chief, looked confused. "This isn't matching the mission profile." "Change of plans, Sergeant. I need maximum range and maneuverability for this sortie." Williams had been Kira's crew chief for over a year, and he had learned to trust her judgment even when it seemed to contradict official orders. "You got it, ma'am, but this is going to take another 20 minutes. "I've got time." Kira's voice carried a quiet confidence that made Williams nod and signal his crew to begin the weapon swap. As the ground crew worked to reconfigure her aircraft, Kira stood in the shadow of the wing, watching the eastern horizon where the first hint of dawn was beginning to show. In 3 hours, her squadron would launch into what she believed was a carefully orchestrated trap. But perhaps, if she was fast enough and lucky enough, she could change the outcome. The radio crackled to life in her helmet as the squadron prepared for startup. "Phoenix, this is lead. Radio check." "Phoenix, loud and clear." "Hammer, radio check." "Hammer 5x5. The familiar ritual continued as each pilot confirmed their communications, but Kira's attention was already focused on the southern horizon. Somewhere beyond those mountains, A fortress waited in its valley, surrounded by defensive systems that hadn't been tested against a single aircraft flying at treetop level through terrain that mapmakers classified as inadvisable for aviation. But Kira wasn't just any pilot. She was Phoenix, a call sign earned through fire, blood, and the kind of flying that existed at the intersection of skill and pure instinct. And in 30 minutes, she would either validate that reputation or become another casualty statistic in a war that had already claimed too many. The engines of the F-16 Fighting Falcon came to life, with a sound that never failed to send electricity through Kira's veins. The twin-spool turbofan engine behind her spun up through its startup sequence, generating the 30,000 pounds of thrust that would carry her into combat. Around the flight line, 3 other aircraft were going through the same ritual, their pilots running through checklists that had been refined through decades of combat experience. Tower, this is Razor Flight, 4 ship, requesting taxi clearance. Razor Flight, cleared to taxi runway 27. Contact ground control frequency 254.7. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes's voice carried the confidence of someone who had led similar missions dozens of times. But as Kira followed the formation toward the runway, her mind was already diverging from the official flight plan. The southern approach wasn't just possible. It was the only way to achieve surprise against an enemy who had spent months preparing for exactly the kind of attack they were about to attempt. The taxiway stretched ahead of them, marked by blue lights that created a path through the darkness. Ground crews stood at various points along the route, their flashlights creating brief pools of illumination as the aircraft passed. The pre-dawn air was crisp and clear, perfect flying, whether that would give them unlimited visibility once the sun rose. Razor Flight, you are cleared for takeoff runway 27. Winds 240 at 8 knots. Visibility unlimited. Razor Flight cleared for takeoff. The 4 F-16s moved into position, their formation precise and professional. But as they prepared for departure, Kira made the decision that would separate her from the group forever. Instead of following the prescribed course toward the western approach, she would break away once they were airborne and head south toward the canyon that everyone else considered impassable. Razor Flight rolling. The acceleration was immediate and overwhelming. 30,000 pounds of thrust pushed Kira back into her ejection seat as her aircraft gathered speed down the runway. At 150 knots, she pulled back on the stick, feeling the familiar transition from ground-bound machine to instrument of aerial warfare. The landing gear retracted with a solid thunk, and suddenly she was airborne, climbing into the star-filled sky with her squadron. Razor Flight, contact departure control frequency 278.3. Razor Flight switching. The radio call was routine, but Kira's heart was pounding with anticipation. In approximately 10 minutes, she would break away from the formation and begin the most dangerous solo flight of her career. The Southern Canyon approach would require flying at an altitude measured in hundreds of feet rather than thousands, threading her aircraft through a passage that was barely wider than her wingspan. Departure control, Razor Flight, flight of 4, climbing through 5,000 for flight level 200. Razor Flight, radar contact, climb and maintain flight level 200, proceed on course 090. The formation climbed steadily through the darkness, their aircraft perfectly positioned in the combat spread that would allow them to support each other if they encountered enemy fighters. But Kira knew that fighters weren't the primary threat. It was the surface-to-air missiles that would reach up from the valley like deadly fingers, guided by radar systems that could track a hummingbird at 20 miles. Razor Flight, this is AWACS. Be advised you have clear skies ahead. No enemy air activity detected. Razor Flight copies. The airborne warning and control system aircraft orbiting 50 miles to the south provided a comforting presence, but Kira knew its radar coverage didn't extend into the mountain valleys where she intended to fly. Once she broke away from the formation, she would be completely alone. relying on her own sensors and instincts to navigate through some of the most dangerous terrain in the theater. "Phoenix, how are you feeling back there?" Hayes's voice on the internal frequency was casual, but Kira could hear the underlying tension. Every pilot dealt with pre-combat nerves differently, and Hayes was checking on his flight members as any good leader would. "Solid lead, ready to light up some bad guys." "That's what I like to hear. Remember, we go in fast, hit hard, and get out clean. No heroics, no improvisation. Stick to the plan and we'll all be home for lunch." "Copy that, lead." But even as she spoke the words, Kira was already visualizing her break away from the formation. The southern canyon was approximately 30 miles ahead, hidden in the mountain range that rose like a wall from the desert floor. Intelligence photos showed it as a narrow slash between two peaks, barely wide enough for a single aircraft flying in perfect formation with the rock walls. The altimeter showed 18,000 feet and climbing. Below them, the desert stretched endlessly, broken only by the occasional road or settlement. But ahead, the mountains grew larger with each passing minute, their peaks sharp and unforgiving in the starlight. "Razor flight, contact tactical frequency 247.5. Razor flight switching to tactical." The frequency change was significant. It meant they were entering the combat zone where radio communications would be brief and professional. No casual conversation, no unnecessary chatter. Every word transmitted could potentially be intercepted by enemy forces, and every second of radio silence was a tactical advantage. "Razor flight, this is Moonbeam. You are 15 minutes from your initial point. Be advised, weather at the target is clear, winds from the southwest at 10 knots. Razor flight copies. 15 minutes. In 15 minutes, the formation would reach the point where they would split up to attack from multiple directions. But Kira wouldn't be with them. In approximately 5 minutes, she would break away and begin her solo run through the southern canyon, flying at an altitude that would make radar detection impossible, but would also leave her with no margin for error. The mountains were clearly visible now, their peaks cutting sharp silhouettes against the star-filled sky. Somewhere in those valleys, the target waited, a fortress that had been responsible for the deaths of 17 American service members. In the official mission profile, it would be attacked by 4 aircraft carrying enough ordnance to level a city block. But Kira believed that precision was more important than overwhelming force, that a single well-placed strike could accomplish what a massive assault might not. "Razor flight, initial point in 10 minutes. Prepare for combat spread." "Razor 2 ready." "Razor 3 ready." "Razor 4 ready." Phoenix was Razor 4, the last aircraft in the formation. In the military hierarchy, she was the least experienced, the most expendable, the one who was expected to follow orders without question. But she was also the one who had earned her call sign by rising from the ashes of impossible situations, by succeeding when success seemed mathematically impossible. The radio crackled with routine communications as the formation prepared for combat. But Kira's attention was focused on the southern horizon, where the canyon entrance was hidden in the pre-dawn darkness. In 3 minutes, she would make the decision that would either validate her reputation or end her career. And somewhere in that fortified valley, an enemy waited with patience and preparation on their side, unaware that their carefully laid trap was about to be challenged by a single pilot who had never learned to accept the word impossible. The moment of decision arrived with the soft chime of a waypoint alert in Kira's helmet. The formation had reached the split point, where they would break into 2 elements for their coordinated attack. But instead of following Razor 3 toward the northwestern approach, Kira banked hard to the south, her aircraft peeling away from the formation like a fighter breaking from a dogfight. "Razor 4, you're off course." Hayes's voice crackled through the radio, confusion evident despite the professional tone. "Return to formation immediately." "Razor 4 is experiencing navigation malfunction," Kira replied, her voice steady despite the lie. "Switching to backup systems, will rejoin as soon as possible." Negative, Razor 4. "Return to formation now. That's a direct order." But Kira was already committed to her course, diving toward the mountain range at a speed that would have been considered reckless in peacetime. The southern canyon was approximately 15 miles ahead, hidden in the shadow of two peaks that rose nearly 8,000 feet above sea level. To reach it, she would have to fly through a maze of valleys and ridges that existed on no navigational chart. Razor 4, respond immediately. The radio call was sharp with command authority, but Kira switched to a different frequency, cutting herself off from the formation. She was alone now, flying toward terrain that mapmakers had marked with warnings about extreme turbulence and suitable for emergency use only. But she had studied the satellite imagery for hours, memorizing every ridge and valley, every possible approach route. The mountains rose around her like walls of stone, their peaks sharp and hostile in the pre-dawn light. The canyon entrance was dead ahead, a narrow slash between two granite faces that looked barely wide enough for a motorcycle, let alone a fighter aircraft traveling at 400 knots. But Kira had calculated the clearances down to the foot, and she knew her aircraft's capabilities better than she knew her own body. The entrance rushed toward her with terrifying speed. At the last possible moment, she rolled the aircraft 90 degrees, presenting the narrow profile of her wings to the canyon walls. The clearance on either side was measured in feet rather than yards, and the slightest miscalculation would turn her into a fireball against the granite walls. Wind shear hit her aircraft like a physical blow, the mountain channeled air creating turbulence that tried to slam her into the canyon walls. But Kira had anticipated this, had planned for the way the wind would funnel through the narrow passage, creating updrafts and downdrafts that could flip an aircraft upside down in seconds. The canyon curved ahead of her, following the natural contours of the mountain range. On either side, the walls rose hundreds of feet into the air, creating a natural tunnel that completely concealed her from enemy radar. But it also trapped her in a passage where the slightest error would be fatal. "Come on, baby," she whispered to her aircraft, feeling the F-16 respond to her inputs with the precision of a surgical instrument. Just a little further. The canyon walls were so close she could see individual rocks, could make out the stress fractures in the granite where millennia of wind and weather had carved their signatures. Her wingtips passed within 10 feet of the stone on either side, and the sound of her engine echoed off the walls in a thunderous roar that announced her presence to anyone within miles. But the canyon was uninhabited, a geological accident that had created the perfect approach route for a pilot willing to risk everything on a single desperate gamble. And Kira was exactly that kind of pilot, the kind who had earned her call sign by refusing to accept defeat, by finding ways to succeed when success seemed impossible. The canyon began to widen as she approached the exit, and suddenly the valley spread out before her like a tactical map come to life. The target complex was exactly where intelligence had indicated, a cluster of buildings surrounded by defensive positions that had been designed to repel a conventional attack. But no one had planned for a single aircraft emerging from the southern canyon at treetop level, flying too low for the radar systems to track. Surface-to-air missile sites were visible as geometric patterns against the natural landscape, their launchers oriented toward the northwest and northeast approaches, where the main attack was expected to arrive. Guard towers stood at regular intervals, their searchlights sweeping predetermined patterns that didn't include the southern approach everyone had dismissed as impossible. Kira's targeting system came alive as she acquired the primary objective, a communications facility that served as the nerve center for the entire complex. One precision strike with her remaining ordnance would sever the enemy's ability to coordinate their defenses, creating the confusion needed for the main attack to succeed. But as she lined up her targeting solution, Kira heard the distinctive sound of missile lock, the high-pitched tone that every combat pilot dreaded. Somewhere in the valley, A surface-to-air missile system had detected her presence and was preparing to engage. She had perhaps 30 seconds before the missile launched, 30 seconds to complete her attack and begin evasive maneuvers that would determine whether she lived or died. The targeting computer displayed a perfect solution, the crosshairs aligned with mathematical precision on the communications facility. But Kira's mind was already calculating escape routes, planning the violent maneuvers that would be necessary to avoid the incoming missile while navigating back through the canyon that had brought her here. Time seemed to slow as she pressed the weapon release button, feeling the aircraft shudder as the precision-guided munition separated from its pylon. The missile streaked toward its target, guided by laser designation that would ensure pinpoint accuracy even in the chaos of combat. And then the sky erupted in flame and smoke as the enemy's defensive systems came alive, filling the air with missiles and cannon fire that turned the peaceful valley into a killing field. But Kira was already moving, her aircraft dancing through the defensive fire with the grace of a bird avoiding a predator. The communication facility disappeared in a brilliant flash of light, secondary explosions indicating that the strike had been successful. But Kira's attention was focused on the surface-to-air missile that was climbing toward her position, its guidance system locked onto her aircraft's heat signature. She had perhaps 10 seconds before impact, 10 seconds to execute the most difficult flying of her career. The missile streaked upward like a deadly arrow, its exhaust trail marking its path through the morning air. But Kira was already executing a defensive maneuver that existed at the very edge of her aircraft's performance envelope, pulling G-forces that pressed her into her ejection seat with crushing intensity. The missile passed within 50 feet of her aircraft, its proximity fuse failing to detonate due to the extreme angle of her evasive maneuver. But there were more missiles in the air now, and the entire valley had become a war zone where death waited with mathematical precision. Kira rolled inverted and dove toward the canyon entrance, her aircraft screaming through the air at a speed that made the canyon walls blur into streaks of granite. Behind her, the valley erupted in chaos as her successful strike triggered alarms and defensive responses throughout the complex. But she was already disappearing into the canyon, her aircraft threading the narrow passage with the same precision that had brought her here. The mission was complete, the target destroyed, and the main attack would face significantly reduced opposition thanks to her unauthorized solo flight. As she emerged from the canyon into the open desert, Kira allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She had proven that the impossible was simply a matter of perspective, that sometimes the most dangerous path was also the most effective. But she also knew that her career as a military pilot was probably over. The radio crackled to life as she rejoined the tactical frequency. Razor 4, this is lead. Report your status immediately. Razor 4 is mission complete, she replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Primary target destroyed, returning to base. The silence that followed was deafening. The aftermath of Operation Nightfall unfolded in the sterile environment of the debriefing room, where fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the faces of men who had spent their careers making life-and-death decisions. Colonel Martinez sat at the head of the table, his weathered hands clasped in front of him, as he reviewed the mission reports that painted a picture of unprecedented success, achieved through unprecedented insubordination. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Martinez said, his voice carrying the weight of command authority. Lieutenant Voss deliberately disobeyed a direct order, broke formation, and conducted an unauthorized solo attack on a heavily defended target. "Yes, sir," replied Major Thompson, the intelligence officer who had spent the past 6 hours analyzing the mission results. "But the intelligence gathered from the strike indicates that her actions were strategically significant." The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications. The main attack had proceeded as planned, with the four-ship formation approaching from the northwest and northeast, according to the original mission profile. But instead of facing the coordinated defense that intelligence had predicted, they had encountered a confusion of uncoordinated responses that suggested their command and control systems had been severely compromised. "What were our losses?" Martinez asked, though he already knew the answer from the preliminary reports. "Zero," Thompson replied. "All aircraft returned safely. The only damage was minor flak damage to Razor 2's wing, and that was superficial." Martinez nodded slowly, his mind working through the tactical implications. The mission had been planned as a high-risk operation with an expected loss rate of at least 50%. Instead, it had been executed with complete success and no casualties. And the reason for that success was sitting in the corridor outside, waiting to face the consequences of her actions. "What about the target assessment?" "Complete destruction of the primary objective," Thompson continued. "The communications facility was eliminated with surgical precision, and secondary explosions indicate that significant intelligence assets were also destroyed. The strike effectively decapitated the entire command structure for the region." "And Lieutenant Voss accomplished this with a single aircraft?" "Yes, sir. Single precision-guided munition, delivered from an approach vector that bypassed 90% of the defensive systems. It was textbook execution, sir." Martinez leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. In 30 years of military service, he had rarely encountered a situation where such clear insubordination had resulted in such decisive success. But he also knew that discipline was the foundation of military effectiveness, and allowing officers to ignore orders, regardless of the outcome, was a dangerous precedent. "Where is Lieutenant Voss now?" "Waiting outside, sir. She's been in the corridor for approximately 2 hours." "Send her in." The door opened to admit Kira Voss, her flight suit still bearing the stains of combat and her hair disheveled from hours in the cockpit. But her posture was erect, her eyes clear, and her bearing that of a professional officer who had done what she believed was necessary. She approached the table and came to attention, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere above Martinez's head. "Lieutenant Voss," Martinez said, his voice neutral, "you have something to say about this morning's mission." "Yes, sir. I deliberately disobeyed orders and conducted an unauthorized strike on the primary target. I accept full responsibility for my actions and any consequences that result." Martinez studied her face, looking for signs of regret or defiance. He found neither. Instead, he saw the calm professionalism of someone who had made a calculated decision and was prepared to face the results. "Lieutenant, do you understand the severity of what you've done? Military discipline exists for a reason. When officers start making independent decisions about mission parameters, the entire command structure breaks down." "I understand, sir. But I also understand that 17 service members died because of intelligence that originated from that facility. The conventional attack profile had a high probability of failure, which would have meant those deaths were meaningless." "That wasn't your decision to make." "No, sir, it wasn't, but it was the right decision." The room fell silent again. Major Thompson shuffled through her papers, clearly uncomfortable with the tension between professional duty and practical results. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, who had led the main attack, stared at the table, his expression unreadable. "Lieutenant Voss," Martinez continued, "your actions this morning represent a fundamental breach of military discipline. Regardless of the outcome, I cannot allow this kind of insubordination to go unpunished. Do you understand that?" "Yes, sir." "However," Martinez paused, choosing his words carefully, "your tactical assessment of the situation proved to be accurate. The Southern approach was indeed the key to mission success. The question is what we do with that information." Kira remained at attention, but Martinez could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. She was a fighter pilot, trained to think tactically and adapt to changing circumstances. But she was also a military officer, bound by the same rules and regulations that governed every other member of the armed forces. "Sir," she said finally, "I know I violated orders. I know that my actions were insubordinate. But I also know that the mission succeeded because someone was willing to take the risk that everyone else said was impossible. If that's worth a court-martial, then so be it." Martinez nodded slowly. "Lieutenant, you're dismissed. Report to your quarters and remain there until further notice. You're grounded pending a full investigation." "Yes, sir." Kira saluted, performed a perfect about-face, and walked out of the room with the same steady confidence she had shown throughout the debriefing. As the door closed behind her, the room remained silent for several long minutes. "Gentlemen," Martinez said finally, "we have a problem. On one hand, we have a clear case of insubordination that cannot be ignored. On the other hand, we have a tactical success that saved lives and accomplished our mission objectives. How do we reconcile those two facts?" Major Thompson spoke first. "Sir, the intelligence value of Lieutenant Voss's strike cannot be overstated. The materials recovered from the communications facility have already provided actionable intelligence that will save lives in future operations. From a purely tactical standpoint, her actions were inspired. But from a disciplinary standpoint, they were completely unacceptable," Hayes added. "If we allow this to go unpunished, we're essentially telling every pilot in the squadron that they can ignore orders whenever they disagree with the mission profile." Martinez nodded. "That's exactly the dilemma we face. The question is whether there's a way to address the disciplinary issues while recognizing the tactical value of what she accomplished." The discussion continued for another hour, but the fundamental problem remained unsolved. Military discipline demanded punishment for insubordination, but practical results suggested that punishment might not serve the best interests of the service. It was a classic conflict between the letter of the law and the spirit of effective leadership. Outside in the corridor, Kira sat on a bench, her mind already working through the possible consequences of her actions. She had known the risks when she broke formation, had understood that her career might be over before she even entered the canyon. But she had also known that the conventional attack was likely to fail, and that failure would mean the deaths of good pilots who deserved better than a textbook assault against a prepared defense. The door to the debriefing room opened, and Major Thompson emerged, her expression thoughtful. She approached Kira and sat down beside her, her voice low enough to avoid being overheard. "Phoenix, you know you've put everyone in an impossible position, right?" "Yes, ma'am, I know. The mission succeeded because of your actions, but the mission also succeeded despite your actions. Do you understand the difference?" Kira considered the question carefully. "I think I do. The mission succeeded because someone was willing to take the risk that the official plan wouldn't take, but it also succeeded despite the fact that I violated orders to make it happen." "Exactly. And that's what makes this situation so complicated. You were right about the tactical situation, but you were wrong about the command structure. Military effectiveness depends on both tactical success and disciplinary consistency." They sat in silence for several minutes, both women understanding the complexity of the situation. Finally, Thompson spoke again. "Phoenix, can I ask you something? When you made the decision to break formation, did you consider the possibility that you might be wrong? That the conventional attack might succeed and your unauthorized strike might complicate things?" "Yes, ma'am. I considered it. But I also considered the possibility that 4 good pilots might die because everyone was too afraid to deviate from a plan that had fundamental flaws. I decided that the risk was worth taking." Thompson nodded. "And now you're prepared to face the consequences?" "Yes, ma'am. I made my choice with full knowledge of what might happen. I'm not asking for leniency or special treatment. I'm asking for the chance to explain why I did what I did." "You'll get that chance. But Phoenix, You need to understand that this isn't just about you anymore. This is about the entire squadron, the entire command structure. The decision that gets made about your case will affect every pilot in the theater." Kira nodded, finally understanding the full scope of what she had set in motion. Her solo flight through the Southern Canyon had been about more than just mission success. It had been about the balance between individual initiative and collective discipline, between tactical innovation and command authority. As Thompson returned to the debriefing room, Kira remained on the bench, staring at the institutional green walls that surrounded her. Somewhere in those walls, decisions were being made that would determine not just her future, but the future of military aviation doctrine. And she had triggered those decisions with a single moment of calculated insubordination that had lasted less than 30 seconds. The investigation into Phoenix's unauthorized mission began with the methodical precision that characterized all military inquiries. Colonel Martinez had assembled a board of officers with impeccable records and diverse backgrounds, each chosen for their ability to evaluate the complex intersection of tactical success and disciplinary failure that defined the case. Major Patricia Henley, the board's senior member, had flown combat missions in 3 different theaters and understood the pressure that led pilots to make split-second decisions under fire. But she also understood that military effectiveness depended on the chain of command, and that even successful insubordination could set dangerous precedents. "The question before this board," Henley said as the formal proceedings began, "is not whether Lieutenant Voss's actions were tactically sound. The intelligence reports clearly indicate that her strike was precisely executed and strategically significant. The question is whether those results justify the means used to achieve them." The hearing room was spartanly furnished, with a long table for the board members and a single chair for witnesses. Kira sat in the witness chair, her dress uniform bearing the ribbons and insignia of a decorated combat pilot. But she also wore the expression of someone who understood that her career hung in the balance. "Lieutenant Voss," Henley continued, "you are charged with willful disobedience of orders, deviation from approved mission parameters, and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. Do you understand these charges?" "Yes, ma'am." "How do you plead?" "Guilty to all charges, ma'am." The admission sent a ripple of surprise through the room. Most officers in her position would have attempted to justify their actions, to find legal technicalities that might reduce their culpability. But Kira had chosen a different path, complete honesty about her actions and their consequences. "Lieutenant," said Colonel Roberts, another board member, "you understand that pleading guilty to these charges could result in court-martial, dismissal from the service, and possible criminal prosecution." "Yes, sir, I understand." "Then why are you taking this approach?" Kira straightened in her chair, her voice clear and steady. "Because I did exactly what I'm accused of doing, sir. I deliberately disobeyed orders because I believed those orders would result in unnecessary casualties. I was right about the tactical situation, but I was wrong to violate the chain of command. I accept responsibility for both the success and the insubordination." Major Henley leaned forward, her expression intense. "Lieutenant, walk us through your decision-making process. At what point did you decide to deviate from the mission profile?" "During the initial briefing, ma'am. The satellite imagery showed defensive positions that would create a killing field for the conventional approach. The Southern Canyon offered an alternative that would achieve surprise, but it required a single aircraft flying at extremely low altitude through dangerous terrain. And you believed you were capable of executing this approach?" "Yes, ma'am. I had studied the topographical data and calculated the clearances. The approach was dangerous, but it was feasible for a pilot with sufficient experience in low-altitude flight." "Why didn't you present this assessment to your commanding officer?" "I did, ma'am. During the briefing, I suggested that the Southern approach might be more effective than the conventional attack profile. My assessment was noted but not incorporated into the mission plan. Colonel Roberts consulted his notes. According to the briefing transcript, you were specifically told that the Southern approach was too dangerous for this mission profile, yet you chose to attempt it anyway. Yes, sir. I believe that the conventional attack would result in significant casualties with a low probability of success. I made the decision to take the risk myself rather than allow others to fly into what I believed was a trap. But that wasn't your decision to make. No, sir, it wasn't, but it was the right decision. The hearing continued for 3 hours, with each board member probing different aspects of Kira's actions and motivations. They examined her flight records, her psychological evaluations, her training history, and her performance in previous combat missions. What emerged was a picture of an exceptional pilot who had consistently demonstrated sound judgment and tactical innovation. But they also uncovered something else, a pattern of independent thinking that had occasionally put her at odds with authority. Not insubordination, exactly, but a willingness to question accepted doctrine when she believed it was flawed. It was a trait that made her effective in combat but potentially dangerous in a military organization that depended on discipline and consistency. Lieutenant Voss, Major Henley said as the formal testimony concluded, is there anything else you would like to say before this board makes its recommendation? Kira stood, her posture erect and her expression serious. Ma'am, I know that what I did was wrong from a disciplinary standpoint. I violated orders, compromised the chain of command, and set a dangerous precedent. I understand that those actions have consequences, and I'm prepared to accept them. She paused, gathering her thoughts. But I also want this board to understand that 17 service members died because of intelligence that originated from that facility. The conventional attack profile had a high probability of failure, which would have meant their deaths were meaningless. I couldn't allow that to happen. So you took it upon yourself to ensure mission success. Yes, ma'am. I took it upon myself to do what I believed was necessary to accomplish the mission while minimizing casualties. I was trained to think tactically, to adapt to changing circumstances, and to make decisions under pressure. That's exactly what I did. But you were also trained to follow orders. Yes, ma'am, and I failed in that responsibility. I made a choice between competing priorities, and I chose tactical effectiveness over disciplinary compliance. I believe it was the right choice, but I understand that it was also the wrong choice. The board members exchanged glances, each recognizing the complexity of the situation. They were dealing with an officer who had achieved remarkable success through clear insubordination, and who accepted responsibility for both the achievement and the violation. Lieutenant, Colonel Roberts said finally, you're dismissed. This board will deliberate and make its recommendation to the commanding officer. You'll be notified of the decision within 48 hours. Yes, sir. Kira saluted, performed an about-face, and left the room with the same steady confidence she had shown throughout the hearing. As the door closed behind her, the board members sat in silence, each contemplating the difficult decision they would have to make. Gentlemen, Major Henley said finally, we have a clear case of insubordination that resulted in exceptional tactical success. The question is whether we punish the insubordination or reward the success. We can't do both, Roberts replied. Either we maintain discipline and punish her actions, or we acknowledge that sometimes insubordination is justified and create a precedent that could undermine the entire command structure. But we also can't ignore the fact that her actions saved lives and accomplished the mission objectives. If we punish her too severely, we're essentially telling every pilot in the squadron that tactical innovation is less important than blind obedience. The debate continued late into the night, but the fundamental dilemma remained unsolved. Military effectiveness required both tactical success and disciplinary consistency, and Kira Voss had created a situation where those two requirements were in direct conflict. Outside, in the quiet of the desert night, Kira sat on the steps of the officers' quarters, staring at the stars that had guided her through the canyon just days earlier. She had made her choice with full knowledge of the consequences, and now she would live with whatever decision the board reached. But she also knew that something had changed in the way people looked at her. The other pilots in the squadron treated her with a mixture of respect and wariness, as if she had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She had proven that the impossible was achievable, but she had also proven that achievement sometimes came at a cost that went beyond personal consequences. In the distance, she could hear the sound of aircraft engines as the night shift prepared for patrol duty. It was a sound that had defined her adult life, the sound of purpose and mission, and the endless cycle of preparation and execution that characterized military aviation. And for the first time in her career, she wasn't sure if she would ever hear it again as a participant rather than an observer. The decision came at 800 hours on a Tuesday morning, delivered by Colonel Martinez himself in the privacy of his office. Kira stood at attention before his desk, her uniform pressed and her bearing professional, but her eyes betrayed the tension of someone waiting for a verdict that would determine the rest of her life. "Lieutenant Voss," Martinez said, his voice carefully neutral, "the board has completed its deliberations and made its recommendation. I've reviewed their findings and made my decision." He paused, studying her face. "Your actions during Operation Nightfall represent a complex case that doesn't fit neatly into standard disciplinary categories. You violated direct orders, compromised the chain of command, and demonstrated a level of insubordination that normally would result in court-martial and dismissal from the service." Kira's expression didn't change, but Martinez could see the slight tightening around her eyes that indicated she was preparing for the worst. "However," he continued, "your tactical assessment proved to be correct, your execution was flawless, and your actions directly resulted in mission success with 0 casualties. The intelligence gathered from your strike has already provided actionable information that will save lives in future operations." Martinez stood and walked to the window, looking out at the flight line where aircraft were being prepared for the day's missions. The board struggled with this case because it represents a fundamental conflict between two essential military principles, discipline and effectiveness. After extensive deliberation, they recommended a course of action that addresses both concerns. He turned back to face her. "Lieutenant Voss, you are hereby formally reprimanded for willful disobedience of orders. This reprimand will become part of your permanent record and will be considered in all future promotion decisions. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "However," Martinez continued, "you are also being recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary achievement in aerial combat. Your actions during Operation Nightfall demonstrated courage, skill, and tactical innovation that exemplify the highest traditions of military aviation." Kira blinked, clearly not expecting this combination of punishment and recognition. "Sir, I don't understand." "Lieutenant, what you did was wrong from a disciplinary standpoint, but what you accomplished was exceptional from a tactical standpoint. The board decided that both aspects of your actions needed to be addressed." Martinez returned to his desk and sat down. "There's something else. You're being reassigned to the Tactical Development Squadron at Nellis Air Force Base. Your new role will be to evaluate unconventional attack profiles and develop training programs for low-altitude precision strikes." "Sir, I'm not being discharged." "No, Lieutenant. You're being promoted. The Air Force needs officers who can think tactically and execute under pressure. But it also needs officers who understand the importance of discipline and chain of command. Your new position will allow you to contribute to tactical innovation while working within the established command structure." Kira remained at attention, but Martinez could see the relief in her eyes. "Sir, I won't let you down." "I know you won't. But, Lieutenant, I want you to understand something. This decision was not made lightly. There were members of the board who argued for court-martial, and there were others who argued for complete exoneration. The compromise we reached reflects the complexity of your case." "I understand, sir." "Do you? Because I'm not sure you fully grasp the impact of what you've done. Your actions have started a conversation about the balance between individual initiative and collective discipline that will continue long after you leave this base. Every pilot in the squadron now knows that sometimes the impossible can be achieved, but they also know that achievement comes with consequences." Martinez leaned back in his chair. "Your new assignment will begin in 30 days. Until then, you'll remain on flight status but will be restricted to training missions only. Use that time to reflect on what you've learned about leadership, about discipline, and about the responsibility that comes with exceptional skill." "Yes, sir." "One more thing, Lieutenant. The Southern Canyon approach you used has been incorporated into our tactical doctrine. It's now officially designated as the Phoenix Route in honor of your call sign. Future pilots will train on that approach, and it will be available as an option for similar missions." Kira's eyes widened slightly. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything. Just remember that with recognition comes responsibility. You've proven that the impossible is possible, but you've also proven that possibility comes with a price. Make sure that price is always worth paying." As Kira left the colonel's office, she felt a mixture of relief and uncertainty. Her career had been saved, but it had also been fundamentally changed. She was no longer just another pilot in the squadron. She was the pilot who had defied orders and succeeded, who had proven that sometimes insubordination could be justified by results. The other pilots in the squadron treated her differently now. Some with respect, some with wariness, and some with the kind of curiosity reserved for phenomena that couldn't be easily explained. She had become a symbol of something larger than herself, the tension between individual initiative and collective discipline that defined military effectiveness. But she had also become something else, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous path was also the most necessary one. The Phoenix route would be flown by other pilots, in other conflicts, facing other impossible situations. And each time they entered that canyon, they would be following a path that had been opened by someone who refused to accept that the impossible was truly impossible. In the months that followed, Kira's story spread throughout the aviation community with the kind of persistence that characterizes legends. It was told in briefing rooms and officer clubs, in training academies and combat squadrons, each telling adding new details and interpretations to the basic facts. Some versions focused on the tactical innovation, emphasizing the precision and skill required to execute the canyon approach. Others concentrated on the disciplinary aspects, using her case as an example of the dangers of individual initiative unchecked by command authority. But all versions agreed on the fundamental truth, that sometimes the impossible was simply a matter of perspective. At Nellis Air Force Base, Kira threw herself into her new role with the same intensity she had brought to combat flying. The Tactical Development Squadron was unlike any unit she had served with before, populated by pilots and engineers who specialized in pushing the boundaries of what was considered possible in aerial warfare. Her office was lined with topographical maps and flight test data, the walls covered with photographs of aircraft in configurations that existed nowhere else in the world. But the centerpiece was a framed satellite image of the Southern Canyon, marked with the flight path she had flown during Operation Nightfall. "The Phoenix route," said Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the squadron commander, as she studied the image. "It's become required training for all attack pilots. Every pilot in the Air Force now knows that canyon approach, and half of them think they can fly it." "Can they?" Kira asked. "Some can. Most can't. but the ones who can have opened up tactical possibilities that didn't exist before your flight. We've successfully used variations of the Phoenix route in 7 different operations, all with positive results. Kira nodded, understanding the implications. Her single act of insubordination had become a standard tactical procedure, incorporated into doctrine and training programs throughout the service. But she also understood that with that incorporation came responsibility. The responsibility to ensure that future pilots understood not just the technique, but the judgment required to execute it safely. "Colonel," she said, "I've been thinking about the training program for the Phoenix route. I think we're focusing too much on the technical aspects and not enough on the decision-making process." "Explain." "The canyon approach isn't just about flying skills. It's about knowing when to take risks and when to follow orders. Every pilot who learns the technique needs to understand that it's not just another tool in the toolbox. It's a last resort that should only be used when conventional approaches won't work." Mitchell nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of thinking I was hoping you'd bring to this position. The technical aspects of the Phoenix route are relatively straightforward. The judgment aspects are much more complex. I'd like to develop a training scenario that emphasizes decision-making under pressure, something that forces pilots to choose between conventional approaches and unconventional tactics, with real consequences for both choices." "Approved, but I want you to remember something, Captain." The promotion had come through the previous week, recognizing both her technical skills and her growing reputation as a tactical innovator. But with the promotion had come new responsibilities and new expectations. "Yes, ma'am. You're not just training pilots to fly the Phoenix route. You're training them to think like Phoenix, and that's a responsibility that goes beyond technical instruction." Kira understood. Her call sign had become more than just an identifier. It had become a symbol of the kind of thinking that pushed boundaries and challenged assumptions. But it had also become a reminder of the cost of that thinking, the price that came with refusing to accept limitations. The training program she developed became known as the Phoenix Protocol, a series of scenarios that forced pilots to make difficult decisions under pressure. Each scenario was designed to test not just flying skills, but judgment, leadership, and the ability to balance individual initiative with collective discipline. The first class to complete the Phoenix Protocol included pilots from every combat squadron in the Air Force. They came to Nelly's expecting to learn advanced flying techniques, but they left with something more valuable, an understanding of the responsibility that came with exceptional skill, and the judgment required to use that skill effectively. "The Phoenix Protocol isn't about creating mavericks," Kira explained to each new class. "It's about creating pilots who can think tactically while respecting the chain of command, who can push boundaries while understanding the consequences of their actions." But even as she spoke the words, Kira knew that some of her students would face situations where those principles would come into conflict. They would encounter moments where tactical necessity seemed to contradict command authority, where the choice between following orders and achieving mission success would define their careers. And in those moments, they would remember the story of Phoenix, the pilot who had defied orders and succeeded, who had proven that sometimes the impossible was simply a matter of having the courage to try. They would remember the Southern Canyon and the precision required to thread an aircraft through its narrow walls, and they would understand that sometimes the most dangerous path was also the most necessary one. The Phoenix route had become more than just a tactical procedure. It had become a philosophy of aviation that emphasized innovation, judgment, and the courage to challenge accepted limitations. And at the center of that philosophy was a pilot whose call sign had become synonymous with the idea that the impossible was simply another way of saying untested. Years passed, and Kira's influence on military aviation doctrine continued to expand. The Phoenix Protocol became standard training for all combat pilots, and the principles she had developed were incorporated into flight schools and tactical academies around the world. But more importantly, the story of her unauthorized flight had become a case study in the balance between individual initiative and collective discipline. In war colleges and command schools, officers studied the Phoenix incident as an example of how exceptional circumstances could sometimes justify exceptional actions. They debated the ethical implications of her choice, the tactical value of her success, and the long-term consequences of her precedent. Some argued that her actions had undermined military discipline and created a dangerous precedent that encouraged insubordination. Others maintained that her tactical innovation had saved lives and demonstrated the importance of adaptive thinking in combat situations. But all agreed that her case had fundamentally changed the conversation about leadership, authority, and the responsibility of individual officers to make difficult decisions under pressure. Kira herself had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and assigned to the Pentagon, where she worked on strategic planning and tactical development for the entire Air Force. Her office overlooked the Potomac River, but the walls were still covered with topographical maps and flight test data, reminders of the canyon approach that had defined her career. "Colonel Voss," said General Patricia Williams, the Air Force Chief of Staff, as she reviewed the latest tactical development reports. "Your Phoenix protocol has become one of our most successful training programs. Pilot performance in complex scenarios has improved by 30% since its implementation." "Thank you, ma'am. But I think the real success is in the decision-making training, not the technical skills." "Explain." "The Phoenix protocol teaches pilots to think strategically about risk and reward, to understand that sometimes the most dangerous option is also the most effective one. But it also teaches them to respect the chain of command and to understand that exceptional actions require exceptional justification." General Williams nodded. "That's exactly what we need in modern warfare. The ability to think tactically while respecting authority, to push boundaries while understanding consequences." "There's something else, ma'am. I've been thinking about the long-term implications of the Phoenix route and the protocol. We're training a generation of pilots who understand that the impossible is achievable, but we're also training them to understand the responsibility that comes with that achievement." "And you think that's important?" "I think it's essential. The Phoenix route isn't just a tactical procedure, it's a mindset. And that mindset needs to be balanced with judgment, discipline, and respect for authority. Otherwise, we risk creating pilots who think that rules don't apply to them." General Williams leaned back in her chair, studying Kira's face. "Colonel, you've become something of a legend in the Air Force. Your call sign is synonymous with tactical innovation and courage under fire, but you've also become a symbol of the tension between individual initiative and collective discipline. How do you feel about that legacy?" Kira considered the question carefully. "Ma'am, I think my legacy is that sometimes the impossible is possible, but that possibility comes with a price. The Phoenix route exists because someone was willing to pay that price, to risk everything on the chance that an untested approach might work." "And you think that's a lesson worth teaching?" "I think it's a lesson that's already been learned. Every pilot who flies the Phoenix route understands that it was created by someone who chose to disobey orders in order to save lives. They understand that the choice was both right and wrong, that it was both necessary and dangerous. And they understand that such choices have consequences. They understand that such choices define who we are as officers and as human beings. The Phoenix route isn't just about flying through a canyon. It's about having the courage to do what's necessary, even when it's also forbidden." General Williams nodded slowly. "Colonel, you've given the Air Force more than just a tactical procedure. You've given us a philosophy of leadership that emphasizes both innovation and responsibility. That's a rare combination, and it's exactly what we need for the challenges ahead." As the conversation ended, Kira returned to her office, where the satellite image of the Southern Canyon still held its place of honor on the wall. The Phoenix route had become part of official doctrine, but it had also become something more, a reminder that sometimes the most important victories were won not by following orders, but by having the courage to question them. The sun was setting over the Potomac, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded her of the pre-dawn light she had flown through during Operation Nightfall. Somewhere in the world, pilots were preparing for missions that would test their skills and their judgment, their ability to balance individual initiative with collective discipline. And some of them would face moments where those principles would come into conflict, where the choice between following orders and achieving mission success would define their careers. In those moments, they would remember the story of Phoenix, the pilot who had proven that sometimes the impossible was simply a matter of having the courage to try. The Phoenix route had become more than just a tactical procedure. It had become a symbol of the idea that limitations were often just untested assumptions, that the impossible was frequently just another way of saying untried. And at the center of that symbol was a pilot whose call sign had become synonymous with the courage to challenge accepted boundaries. But Kira also knew that her story was just one chapter in the larger narrative of military aviation, that future pilots would face their own impossible situations and would have to make their own choices about when to follow orders and when to follow their conscience. The Phoenix route would be there for them, a tool and a symbol, but the decision to use it would always be theirs. In the end, that was perhaps the most important lesson of all, that courage wasn't about having the right answers, but about having the strength to ask the right questions, even when those questions led to difficult and dangerous choices. The Phoenix route existed because someone had been willing to ask those questions, to challenge the assumption that the impossible was truly impossible. And as long as there were pilots willing to ask those questions, willing to push boundaries and challenge limitations, the spirit of Phoenix would continue to fly through the dangerous skies of possibility, forever proving that sometimes the most important victories were won not by following the safest path, but by having the courage to create a new one. The legacy of the Phoenix route continued to evolve as new generations of pilots learned not just the technical aspects of canyon flying, but the deeper lessons about leadership, judgment, and the courage to make difficult decisions under pressure. What had begun as a single act of insubordination had become a fundamental part of military aviation doctrine, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous path was also the most necessary one. In flight schools around the world, instructors used the Phoenix incident as a case study in tactical decision-making, emphasizing both the innovation that had led to success and the disciplinary violations that had made that success possible. Students learned to navigate the complex ethical terrain that surrounded the story, understanding that leadership often required making choices that were simultaneously right and wrong, necessary and forbidden. Colonel Kira, Phoenix, Voss had become more than just a pilot. She had become a symbol of the tension between individual initiative and collective discipline that defined military effectiveness. Her story was told in briefing rooms and officer clubs, in training academies and combat squadrons, each telling adding new layers of meaning to the basic facts. But perhaps the most important aspect of her legacy was the understanding that courage wasn't about having the right answers, but about having the strength to ask the right questions, even when those questions led to difficult and dangerous choices. The Phoenix route existed because someone had been willing to ask those questions, to challenge the assumption that the impossible was truly impossible. And as long as there were pilots willing to ask those questions, willing to push boundaries and challenge limitations, the spirit of Phoenix would continue to fly through the dangerous skies of possibility, forever proving that sometimes the most important victories were won not by following the safest path, but by having the courage to create a new one. The canyon still stands in the mountains, its narrow walls bearing no permanent mark of the aircraft that once threaded its passage at impossible speed. but in the memories of those who fly, in the doctrine that guides their training, and in the stories that inspire their courage. The phoenix root lives on, a testament to the idea that the impossible is often just another way of saying, untested. In the end, that may be the most important lesson of all, that limitations are often just untested assumptions, that boundaries exist to be challenged, and that sometimes the most dangerous path is also the most necessary one. The phoenix root stands as a reminder that courage isn't about having the right answers, but about having the strength to ask the right questions, even when those questions lead to difficult and dangerous choices. And in the silence between the canyon walls, where the echo of jet engines once announced the presence of someone who refused to accept that the impossible was truly impossible, the spirit of Phoenix continues to fly, forever proving that sometimes the most important victories are won not by following orders, but by having the courage to question them. The story of Phoenix had become more than just a military legend. It had become a philosophy of life that emphasized the importance of challenging assumptions, pushing boundaries, and having the courage to do what was necessary, even when it was also forbidden. And in that philosophy, in that courage, in that willingness to question the impossible, lay the true legacy of the pilot who had earned her call sign by rising from the ashes of accepted limitation. The Phoenix route would continue to be flown by future generations of pilots, each one carrying forward the understanding that sometimes the most important victories were won not by following the safest path, but by having the courage to create a new one. And in that continuation, in that perpetual challenge to accepted boundaries, the spirit of Phoenix would live on, forever proving that the impossible was often just another way of saying, untried. In the final analysis, the Phoenix route had become more than just a tactical procedure. It had become a symbol of the human spirit's refusal to accept limitations, a reminder that courage and innovation could overcome even the most daunting obstacles. And at the center of that symbol was a pilot whose call sign had become synonymous with the idea that the impossible was simply another word for untested. The legacy of Phoenix would continue to inspire future generations of aviators, soldiers, and leaders, reminding them that sometimes the most important victories were won not by following orders, but by having the courage to question them. And in that questioning, in that willingness to challenge accepted boundaries, lay the true power of the Phoenix route, not just as a tactical procedure, but as a philosophy of life that emphasized the importance of pushing limits and refusing to accept that the impossible was truly impossible. The canyon walls still stand, silent witnesses to the passage of someone who refused to accept that the